In 1982, a woman in Canada began reporting that someone was stalking her. She received threatening calls, notes, and claimed she was being watched constantly. At first, police treated it as a serious case of harassment and potential escalation. Then the incidents became physical. She was found injured, restrained, and barely alive. The attacks appeared real, but the evidence never pointed to a clear suspect. Investigators followed multiple directions, but every lead collapsed under scrutiny. Over time, the case began to shift, not because the attacks stopped, but because the story stopped making sense. What looked like a victim under threat slowly turned into something far more complicated. By the end, the case would force investigators to question what was real and what was not. At first, the reports followed a pattern investigators recognized as stalking behavior. Cindy James described repeated phone calls, hang-ups, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Notes began appearing, often threatening, suggesting escalation beyond simple harassment. Police treated the case as real, assigning patrols and monitoring her home. Friends and co-workers confirmed she was increasingly distressed, reinforcing the threat. Then the case escalated when she was found outside her home, injured and restrained. This shifted the investigation from harassment to attempted violence. However, there were no witnesses, no forced entry, and no clear suspect identified. Despite increased attention, the attacker was never seen entering or leaving the area. From this point, the case moved forward with one problem. The threat was real, but the source was not. After the first incident, police increased surveillance around her home. Officers conducted regular patrols, expecting the attacker to return. The calls and notes continued even while police were nearby. This suggested the offender was either watching closely or already inside the pattern of investigation. Then another incident occurred. She was found again, restrained under similar conditions. The timing raised a critical question. How was this happening under active police presence? Investigators reviewed response times, patrol routes, and gaps in coverage. No breach or external entry could be confirmed during those windows. This shifted the direction toward someone with knowledge of police movement. But even that theory failed, because no suspect could be placed near the scene. As incidents continued, investigators began noticing inconsistencies in the timeline. Some events occurred in ways that did not align with physical possibility. In certain cases, there was no clear window for an external attacker to enter or leave. This introduced a new direction, questioning whether all incidents were caused by the same person. Investigators re-examined earlier evidence, looking for signs that had been overlooked. Attention shifted toward the possibility that the pattern itself was not consistent. Then a critical shift occurred when some incidents appeared to happen without any external presence at all. This raised a question that had not been considered at the start of the case. Could some of the events have been staged? The investigation moved from identifying an attacker to questioning the reality of the threat itself. As doubt entered the case, investigators split into two conflicting directions. One group continued treating Cindy as a victim under threat. Another began examining whether she was connected to the incidents herself. The evidence supported both sides, which made the case harder to resolve. She continued reporting threats, reinforcing the idea that the danger was ongoing. At the same time, physical evidence still failed to confirm an external attacker. Investigators increased control over the environment, limiting variables during incidents. Despite this, events continued to occur without a clear source. This created a contradiction. Either the attacker was highly sophisticated, or the events were not what they appeared. The case moved forward without resolution, but now with two competing realities. The case reached a critical point when investigators attempted to control every variable. Surveillance was intensified, and her movements were monitored more closely. The expectation was clear. If an attacker existed, they would be exposed under these conditions. However, incidents still occurred even within controlled observation periods. This forced investigators to confront a possibility they had resisted from the beginning. The pattern of events no longer aligned with an external threat. At the same time, there was no clear explanation for how the incidents were being produced. This created a deadlock between evidence and interpretation. Then the case shifted again when Cindy James was found in a final fatal condition. Now the investigation had to answer not only what happened, but what had always been happening. Following her death, investigators reconstructed the entire case from the beginning. Without relying on her statements, they focused only on physical evidence and timelines. This removed the narrative that had guided the investigation for years. When the events were analyzed independently, the pattern changed. Many incidents could not be supported by external evidence. Entry points, timing, and conditions suggested internal origin rather than outside intrusion. This shifted the primary direction toward a self-generated sequence of events. Investigators examined psychological factors that could explain the behavior. The case was no longer about identifying an attacker, but understanding the contradictions. What remained was a pattern that could not be explained by a single external offender. With all evidence reviewed, investigators concluded there was no identifiable external attacker. The incidents that appeared connected could not be consistently supported by physical evidence. This led to the conclusion that many events were likely self-generated over time. The case shifted from a stalking investigation to a psychological interpretation of behavior. Her final death remained officially undetermined, with no confirmed third-party involvement. There was no clear evidence of motive in the traditional sense of an external crime. Instead, the case reflected a pattern driven by internal factors rather than outside intent. Investigators could not fully explain every event, leaving some elements unresolved. The contradictions that shaped the case ultimately redefined it entirely. What began as a search for an attacker ended as a case where the reality itself was questioned.